We can build a parallel system that puts people before profit because a small town in Spain has already shown us how. In the aftermath of a civil war and World War II, a priest and 5 workers started a worker-owned business that grew into a network of 100 worker-owned cooperatives within just 30 years. They created their own bank, healthcare, welfare, education system, housing projects, community projects, funded by the profits of those businesses. They built a whole new economic system alongside the one that already existed, but what most people don't know is what made it actually work. If you want to know what it takes to build a real alternative, not a theory, not a small experiment, but something that has actually worked at scale, this series breaks it all down. In this video, we're going back to the beginning to understand the conditions that Mondragon emerged from. We'll look at the political climate, we'll look at the social history of co-ops in Spain and the wider economic pressures at the time. Because to understand what they did and what we can learn, we need to understand what they were up against. So let's start with the political climate. Before Mondragon was founded in 1956, Spain had gone through decades of turmoil. The Spanish Civil War ended in 1939 with the rise of Francisco Franco. He ruled as a dictator until his death in 1975. Under his regime, political parties were banned, strikes were illegal, and unions were systematically dismantled. Franco set up a dictatorship that borrowed ideas from Mussolini's regime in Italy. The regime replaced independent unions with state-run bodies designed to manage workers from the top down. The Basque region where Mondragon emerged was especially hostile to Franco's regime because it had strong leftist and pro-independence traditions, and many of the Basque people had fought against him during the war. After Franco and the Spanish nationalists won the war, the region faced political repression, including suppression of the Basque language, loss of regional autonomy, and close surveillance of social movements. However, over time, especially during the 1950s, the regime began loosening certain controls. This allowed for slightly more economic and organizational flexibility, even though the broader authoritarian structure remained. Worker cooperatives had existed in Spain since at least the mid-19th century. Between 1931 and 1936, worker cooperatives spread rapidly across the country. However, during the Civil War under Franco, these movements were either dismantled or absorbed into the state-controlled economy. By the time of Mondragon's founding, Spain's cooperative sector was fragmented and weak. Cooperatives were often isolated, lacked technical and financial support, and were heavily regulated by the state. There was no cohesive ecosystem at that point. Many of the earlier cooperatives failed not because the model was unworkable, but because they had no access to credit, no training infrastructure, and no second-tier institutions to help them through hardship and transition. That part is important because it reveals that Mondragon was not building on a strong national tradition. It was building something new in a hostile environment with no safety net. Under Franco, the Catholic Church backed the regime publicly, but not everyone inside the church felt the same. Some clergy used their protected status to provide space for alternative ideas. Here's where Jose Maria Arizmendi Arrieta comes in. He's the priest that initiated the Mondragon movement. Jose Maria arrived in Mondragon in the early 1940s and began his work quietly, under the radar of the state. Church buildings were often the only legal spaces where community members could gather, discuss, and organize. This doesn't mean that the church as an institution supported cooperatives, but individual priests like Arizmendi Arrieta created space for new forms of education and solidarity under difficult conditions. Franco's labor system eliminated independent unions and replaced them with jurados de empresa. I apologize for my Spanish. These were internal councils that were supposed to represent workers but were tightly controlled. By the 1950s, Spain's economy was starting to open up, partly out of necessity. productivity problems, internal pressures, domestic dissatisfaction made the rigid system much harder to enforce. This gave cooperatives like Mondragon a narrow window in which they could organise, especially if they appear apolitical. Around the same time, the Basque nationalist group ETA was founded. They believed the only way to win freedom was through force. They opposed Franco through violent resistance, including attacks and extortion, even targeting businesses in the Basque region. Mondragon took a different path. It didn't align with political violence. Its strategy was to build economic alternatives quietly through education, technical training, and shared ownership. This contrast is significant because you see one group that is trying to force change through aggression and the other which is trying to build power through infrastructure. And you see, whilst Mondragon grew over time, ETA became increasingly isolated and was ultimately dismantled by the state. So now we know that Mondragon didn't emerge from an ideal setting. It grew under authoritarian rule in a region recovering from war without a strong legacy of co-ops to build on. The political climate was extremely hostile. The economic system was extremely rigid. The cooperative history and tradition was short-lived and fairly weak. Yet in this environment, they were able to create a network within 30 years that would employ nearly 20,000 people and fund their own bank, education system, healthcare, welfare, the works. This background is extremely important because it addresses that common objection that successful cooperatives only emerge in ideal cultural and political settings, when in fact the early conditions for Mondragon were anything but ideal. What made Mondragon work wasn't the environment, it was the design, the infrastructure, and the long-term strategy. In the next video, we'll look at how it actually started, the first co-op, the first workers, and how it grew from one workshop into a whole network. Follow for more.